Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have another great show for you tonight. We've had incredible news over the past couple of weeks, and we have some big stories since we recorded last. You know, we've been doing our show live for many years, since about 1999. The show started in 1996, but we taped in a studio with Lanny Swerdlow. But starting in 1999, we've been recording at the Portland Community Access, which has morphed into Open Signal PDX, local cable TV studio. So since the pandemic last March, we've been recording here in our office. We never anticipated going quite this long, but I'm sure you didn't either. We have some incredible hemp news this week and another exciting guest, but just stay tuned as we bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, our first story tonight deals with the United States Congress. Two huge breakthroughs happened last week. That one chamber of the U.S. Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, passed the MORE Act to legalize marijuana. And even more significantly, the World Health Organization and the United Nations removed medical cannabis from the list of prohibited medicines. Of the two, the World Health Organization and United Nations changing international law to allow the medical use of marijuana is now officially enacted. The passage of the MORE Act, while significant as a first breakthrough in Congress, won't be taken up by the Senate in these final days of this session of Congress. The vote on the MORE Act in the U.S. House of Representatives passed by 228 to 164. As in Mexico, where Mexico's Senate passed legalization 2 weeks ago, the sequence of events and outcomes will be the same. They're going to kick the can down to the future, and neither will become law. The bill in Mexico won't pass because their Chamber of Deputies, which is like the U.S. House of Representatives, isn't going to take it up. The MORE Act won't pass here in the United States because the United States Senate won't take it up. Neither will become law now, which is probably good since both the Mexican and the American proposals are somewhat flawed. The MORE Act requires a federal license in addition to existing state licenses. It sets up an additional federal tax of 5% on top of the existing state and local ones, and it denies licenses to people convicted of past cannabis offenses, even though it will expunge or remove the criminal records of those convicted in U.S. federal court of possession of less than an ounce of cannabis. I like the MORE Act and the fact that it'll expunge federal convictions for simple possession of less than an ounce. I happen to have two of those, one in the United States Capitol in 1989 and another one in my home in 1991. Yes, federal charges in my home here in Portland, Oregon. That's another story. But it denies federal licensing for non-expungible cannabis felony convictions, which was added as a Republican amendment just in the final days before the act was put up for a vote. So yes, there's a lot of work to do. We'll have to lobby for better, more equitable legislation in the future. Again, a United Nations Commission voted last Wednesday to remove cannabis for medicinal purposes from a category of the world's most dangerous drugs, a highly anticipated and long-delayed decision that could clear the way for an expansion of marijuana research for medical use and legalization. The vote by the Commission for Narcotics Drugs, which is based in Vienna and includes 53 member states, considered a series of recommendations from the World Health Organization on reclassifying cannabis and its derivatives. But attention centered on a key recommendation to remove cannabis from the most restrictive schedule in the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, where it was listed alongside dangerous and highly addictive opioids like heroin. Experts say the vote will have no immediate impact on loosening international controls because governments will still have jurisdiction over how to classify cannabis. But many countries look to global conventions for guidance, and the United Nations recognition is a symbolic win for advocates of drug policy change who say that international law is out of date. A key United Nations panel approved a World Health Organization recommendation to remove marijuana from the most restricted global scheduling category. With the backing of the U.S. government, the UN's Commission on Narcotic Drugs adopted the proposal to delete cannabis from the most restricted category in the Single Convention, 1961. This doesn't mean that member nations are cleared to legalize marijuana, however, as it remains under a separate schedule in the international drug control system. But advocates say it demonstrates an evolution in how the international community views cannabis policy, as it formally recognizes the medical value of the plant and it could promote further research into its therapeutic potential. The World Health Organization made 6 recommendations on global cannabis policy last year, and the Center for Narcotic Control has held numerous meetings on the proposal. After numerous meetings and delays, members finally held votes on the meeting last week. The proposal to remove marijuana from the most restrictive schedule was arguably the most consequential of the reforms and is the only one that was approved. The international scheduling system differs from that in the United States in that the country's most restricted category is Schedule 1. The vote to move cannabis out of its restrictive scheduling was close, with 27 countries voting in favor and 25 against, and 1 abstention. Marijuana for medical use has exploded in recent years, and products containing cannabis derivatives like cannabidiol or CBD, a non-intoxicating compound, have flooded the wellness industry. An investment and financial service company estimates that the CBD industry in the United States will be worth $16 billion by 2025. Some researchers have suggested that CBD can protect the nervous system and provide relief from seizures, pain, anxiety, and inflammation. The list of CBD-infused products, including creams, serums, soda water, and juice, is also expanding rapidly. The recommendations for changing the classification of marijuana were first made by the World Health Organization last year in 2019, but they were politically divisive, which led to unusual delays in the United Nations Commission vote. The reclassification passed 27 to 25 with an abstention from the Ukraine. The United States and European nations were among those who voted in favor, while the likes of China, Egypt, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Russia were opposed. China's delegate said that despite the United Nations move, the country would strictly control cannabis, quote, to protect from the harm and abuse, end quote. Britain's delegate said the reclassification was, quote, in line with the scientific evidence of its therapeutic benefits, quote, but the country still strongly supported international controls from cannabis, adding that marijuana presented, quote, serious public health risks, end quote. That's what they say, folks. They're just so ignorant. The differing messages underline the complexities behind the decision. Mr. Rabelais-Zemeli said, quote, it's been a diplomatic circus, end quote, and added that some of the countries initially opposed to the change, like France, had since switched their position. Michael Kravitz, a guest on our show, Executive Director for Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, an advocacy group here in the United States, said the change in international law would, quote, help reduce the suffering millions of people and could help mitigate reliance on opiates, noting that cannabis was an important medication that can provide unique pain relief. The overhaul of cannabis policy, particularly around legalization for medical use, has moved at a rapid pace over the last few years. Industry insiders have expressed hope that the vote will open the field for more research into the therapeutic benefits of the drug. But the impact on the American and European markets was the driving issue. In the United States, where more states legalized the use of medical and recreational marijuana in our election last month, the market for both of those is expected to expand to more than $34 billion in 2025, according to the business group. Before the vote this week, and other decriminalization efforts, share prices of some cannabis companies had jumped. But aside from the financial boon it could provide for American and European marijuana markets, downgrading the dangers of cannabis may have been the biggest impact on countries that have more conservative policies, such as many Caribbean and Asian nations. Something like this does not mean that legalization is just going to happen but around the world, but it removes what have been a formidable barrier to freedom. After 6 decades since its placement into the strictest international category and 3 years of review, the United Nations has finally made the decision to recognize the therapeutic value of cannabis. This is a momentous occasion for cannabis advocates everywhere who've been fighting for this change for many years, and long overdue recognition that cannabis is a medicine from this international body. However, this reform alone is far from adequate, given that cannabis remains incorrectly scheduled at the international level. The original decision to prohibit cannabis back in the 1930s and 1960, when this initiative was passed, lacked scientific basis and was rooted in colonial prejudice and racism. It disregarded the rights and traditions of communities that have been growing and using cannabis for medicinal, therapeutic, religious, and cultural purposes for centuries, perhaps millennia, and have led to millions being criminalized and incarcerated across the globe. The review process has been a missed opportunity to correct that historic error. Here in the United States, litigation is pending in 3 states, Mississippi, Montana, and South Dakota, to invalidate successful statewide ballot measures legalizing marijuana access that passed on November 3rd. These are cynical attempts to undermine the democratic process. Legalization opponents have shown time and time again that they cannot succeed in either the court of public opinion or at the ballot box. Thus, they're now asking judges to set aside the votes of over 1 million Americans in a desperate effort to override undisputed election outcomes. Whether or not one supports marijuana legalization, Americans should be outraged at these overtly undemocratic tactics. In Mississippi, where 73% of voters decided in favor of Measure 65, legalizing medical cannabis access, the state Supreme Court is scheduled to hear arguments specific to a lawsuit filed by the city of Madison, Mississippi. City officials filed a legal challenge days prior to the election, claiming that the legislature's failure to update guidelines for petitioners should invalidate the initiative vote. Notably, litigants failed to challenge legal status of a separate initiative that also appeared on the 2020 ballot, despite the fact that petitioners for that initiative acted no differently than they did those who advocated for the marijuana measure. In Montana, where 57% of voters decided in favor of Initiative 190, legalizing the adult use marijuana market, a lawsuit's been filed on behalf of the opposition group Wrong for Montana. Their suit claims that the initiative language is unconstitutional because it earmarks a portion of tax revenue from retail marijuana sales. Plaintiffs contend that only the legislature can determine how tax revenue is spent. The suit seeks to void the entirety of the initiative language, not just the portion of the initiative relative to appropriating tax revenues. Litigants filed a similar legal challenge just prior to the election, but the Supreme Court declined to hear the case at that time. In South Dakota, where 54% of voters decided in favor of a constitutional amendment A, legalizing the adult use marijuana market, a pair of law enforcement officers recently filed suit seeking to invalidate the vote based upon the claim that the ballot language violates the state's single subject rule. Notably, plaintiffs have not similarly challenged a separate 2020 ballot also passed by voters legalizing the production and dispensing of medical cannabis. In Nebraska, opponents of a proposed medical marijuana legalization measure successfully litigated to keep it off the ballot by making a similar argument before the election. The Nebraska office of Republican Governor Kristi Noem, who publicly opposed both South Dakota legalization initiatives, is reportedly providing a portion of the funding for the legal challenge. Prior to the election, marijuana legalization opponents in Arizona also filed a lawsuit attempting to have Proposition 207, the Smart and Safe Arizona Act, struck from the ballot. That litigation was unsuccessful. Arizonans ultimately passed the marijuana legalization measure by a margin of 60% to 40%. As I record this on Tuesday, December 8th, members of the U.S. House of Representatives are anticipated to hold a floor vote on another marijuana bill this week called H.R. 3797, the Marijuana Research Act, which seeks to facilitate clinical cannabis research by establishing a process so that approved scientists may access flowers and other products manufactured in accordance with state authorized programs. The bill will be considered under a procedure known as suspension of the rules, meaning that there will be no further amendments and it will require a 2/3 majority to pass. Given the bipartisan nature of the legislation, sponsored by an unlikely duo of Portland, Oregon's own pro-legalization Representative Earl Blumenauer and prohibitionist Representative Andy Harris, a Republican of Maryland, it's expected to get that support. Members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee advanced a version of the measure in September. Under the existing regulatory system, which has been in place for more than 5 decades, there's only one federally licensed entity, the University of Mississippi, that's permitted to cultivate and had to provide marijuana for use in FDA-approved clinical studies, and to the few patients who receive it, such as L.B. Masika and Irv Rosenfeld. Scientists have consistently criticized the poor quality of the university's plants, which they say fail to accurately reflect the varieties of marijuana commercially available in the United States. Nonetheless, the current system does not permit scientists to access state-licensed marijuana products as part of an FDA-approved protocol. This proposed regulatory change is necessary and long overdue. According to the federal government's marijuana menu, scientists may currently select from no more than 6 varieties of pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes, none of which possess THC concentrations above 7% or CBD concentrations above 1%. Other types of cannabis-infused products like tinctures and concentrates are not available for clinical study here in the United States because of this law. In 2016, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency pledged to expand the pool of federally licensed entities permitted to grow cannabis, but to date, the agencies failed to act on more than 30 applications before them. The Marijuana Research Act would permit an unlimited number of federally licensed entities to participate in this space. Legislative action is necessary in this arena because the DEA has proven time and time again that it is not an honest broker in this process. Despite promising over 4 years ago to expand the pool of federal licenses permitted to provide cannabis for clinical research, the DEA has steadfastly refused to do so, leaving scientists with woefully inadequate supplies of cannabis and cannabis products available for human studies. The reality that most high schoolers have easier access to cannabis than do our nation's top scientists is the height of absurdity and an indictment of the current system. The announcement of the forthcoming floor vote comes on the heels of the lower chamber on Friday voting in favor of the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, H.R. 3884, which removes marijuana from the Federal Controlled Substances Act, thereby eliminating the existing conflict between states and federal marijuana laws, providing states with the authority to establish their own cannabis laws free from undue federal interference. Interested parties who are in favor of this act should contact their lawmakers and urge them to pass H.R. 3797, the Marijuana Research Act. There's a new survey out. According to this, a supermajority of Americans support expunging marijuana-related convictions. 70% of respondents favor expunging the criminal records of those with marijuana-related convictions, according to national polling data compiled by YouGov.com. The pollsters asked, do you support or oppose expunging marijuana-related convictions for non-violent offenders? 7 in 10 respondents supported expungement, while only 17% opposed the process. Support is bipartisan, with a majority of Democrats at 81%, Independents at 69%, and Republicans at 57% endorsing expungement of marijuana convictions. Last Friday, members of the U.S. House of Representatives voted in favor of the MORE Act, of course, to expunge federal marijuana-related convictions and provide inducement for states to facilitate the review and expungement of state-level marijuana records. Only 5 Republicans voted in favor of this bill, and 6 Democrats voted against it. Millions of citizens unduly carry the burden and stigmatization of past conviction for behavior that most Americans no longer believe ought to be a crime, and that in a growing number of states is no longer classified as a crime by statute. Our sense of justice and our principles of fairness demand that officials move swiftly to right the past wrongs of cannabis prohibition and criminalization. Over a dozen states have enacted legislation explicitly permitting or facilitating the process of having past marijuana convictions expunged, vacated, or otherwise set aside or sealed from public view. In New Jersey's legislative leaders reached an agreement on the final details of a proposed plan to legalize the commercial marijuana market. In a joint statement issued last week by Democratic Governor Phil Murphy, the Senate President, the Assembly Speaker, and the Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman, and the Assembly Majority Conference Chair, lawmakers announced, quote, "We've reached an agreement on legislation providing the framework for legalization, which is a critical step in reducing racial disparities and social inequities that have long plagued our justice system. This legislation will accomplish our shared goals of delivering restorative justice and ensuring that the communities most impacted by the war on drugs see the economic benefits of the adult use cannabis market. While there's still much work ahead, we are only a step closer to building a new promising industry for New Jersey," end quote. New Jersey voters overwhelmingly approved Public Question 1 on Election Day in November, which instructs New Jersey's lawmakers to enact legislation permitting for adults to possess and purchase marijuana from licensed retailers. The New Jersey Globe reports that the agreement among the state's top lawmakers calls for capping the number of commercial cultivators at 37 for the first 2 years and directing 70% of the revenue derived from sales taxes towards social justice programs. The bill will be considered by the Senate Judiciary Committee on December 14th and be sent to the floor for a vote on December 17th. So that vote is coming up. The time for legislative action on marijuana legalization is now. I commend legislative leaders for finally coming to an agreement and urge the swift enactment of these regulations and the immediate end to marijuana arrests in the Garden State. Voters made their mandate clear: stop arresting our friends, family, and neighbors for marijuana, and instead replace the failed policy of prohibition with a pragmatic regulatory framework that focuses on social equity and reinvesting in communities most harmed by the drug war. That's the end of our hemp news segment for tonight. We are coming up with our interviews. Stay tuned and help restore hemp. Good night. Okay, Michael, it's great to have you back here on Cannabis Common Sense. We just had you here. Michael is the Director of Veterans for Medical Access. Is that the right name?
Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. Yep.
Medical Cannabis Access. And you're based in Virginia in the Washington, D.C. area. And
well, Virginia in the mountains, actually.
Oh, okay. Okay. Beautiful area. Near Shenandoah? I don't know. That's probably
Not
more.
too far. Yep. We're right off the Appalachian Trail in the New River Valley.
All right. So tell us how you became a cannabis activist. You know, you have been instrumental recently with the group of people who helped activists who pressured the World Health Organization and the United Nations CND, and that's pretty monumental and historical. Do you want to first just tell us what the World Health Organization and CND have done?
Sure. So the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, that's the United Nations body that is delegated the authority year to year to update the treaties that the 186 countries, including the USA, have signed into on drugs. And the World Health Organization has the responsibility within that treaty to update the United Nations based on the science, based on the evidence, where drugs, particular substances, should be placed either changing their placement and schedule, adding into, or removing from control in the treaty. And the World Health Organization was handed this request to review cannabis about 5 years ago. It was an interesting backstory, if you want to get into that, with Japan and Azerbaijan. But anyway, we get back to that in a second. But anyway, in 2015, they passed this over to the World Health Organization. It took them several years to work through their evidentiary process. It's actually a pretty, I would say, adequate scientific review. I mean, they went through in 3 years what we've done in 20 years in our movement, and they did a pretty good job. I'd say a really competent job. And as a result of that, they made several whole lists, actually 6 different recommendations to change the schedule and placement of cannabis in the Drug Control Treaty, handed that back to the United Nations a couple of years ago. And it actually took the United Nations a couple of years to digest it, actually finally put it up for a vote. And that's what happened last Wednesday, when we actually did succeed in, oddly enough, passing the most ambitious of the recommendations into law and not the others. The backstory that I alluded to, Japan and Azerbaijan back in 2009 put forth a resolution inside the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And when they do so, when the resolution is put forward in the commission, it has to be passed by consensus. And so they did, in fact, get
Japan and Azerbaijan.
Japan and Azerbaijan put their names on a resolution. And that resolution, like I said, gets put up to a consensus process, and it did pass consensus. And what the resolution called for, it was a resolution on cannabis seeds. And it called for the World Health Organization to look into whether cannabis seeds should be added into control. Now, cannabis seeds are specifically listed as an example of the exempt category of industrial use, which is hemp. Hemp, right. Hemp is exempt, and hemp is exempt in the treaty. And because hemp is exempt, that was a pretty big lift to add seeds to actually do such a big thing. It was I think a much bigger lift than Japan and Azerbaijan thought at the time. And indeed, they were trying. Japan was very clear that they wanted to try to add more control, make it tighter control. And in fact, all those years later, 11 years later, the process kicked out what is the very first reform of the Drug Control Treaty since its passage in 1960.
Japan voted against it. Probably Azerbaijan did as well. I know Russia voted against the World Health Organization's. It was 27-25 with the Ukraine abstaining.
Ukraine, just Ukraine. The Russians call it the Ukraine, so I try to abstain from calling it the Ukraine. It's just Ukraine. So anyway, odd things you learn as a cannabis ambassador, right? But indeed, Ukraine was incredibly important to us. Had they not abstained, it could have tilted the vote. Had the United States not voted in favor of the removal of cannabis from Schedule 4, then we wouldn't have won the vote. And the United States was pretty clear about it when we met with them a couple weeks ago, that the reason why they were voting in favor was because cannabis, plant-based cannabis, was approved by the FDA recently in the United States for human use. And we're like, really? And they said, yeah, Epidiolex. So it's funny how Epidiolex has had much bigger kind of impact perceptually to the government than it has within our own movement. We just look at it as one of the many CBD substances preparations that we have access to. It didn't really move our dial as much as evidently it moved the United States federal government's dial. So it's another interesting side note. But anyway, this change, just before we go on and move away from it, is actually quite profound. Pulling cannabis out of Schedule 4 is the so-called prohibition schedule. Schedule 1 is the regular control schedule that literally applies to virtually every drug under control. It's not special in any way, and everything in there is considered something that has medicinal value, unless it's put in Schedule 4 as well, and that means that it doesn't have medicinal value. In fact, Schedule 4 meant that it was very dangerous and very unknown. Extremely dangerous and extremely unknown, as a matter of fact, right there next to heroin and very, very dangerous drugs of abuse.
Yeah, wasn't there a move to put THC back into the schedule with the the World Health Organization, and that was rejected?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, without going into when the State Department explained this, they took a full hour and 45 minutes. So let me see if I can divide that by 10 and do a 1.45 minute explanation. But the thing is that the World Health Organization had 6 recommendations. The UN only passed 1 into law. 4 out of the 6 could just be seen as sort of housekeeping. Like you said, moving THC from one treaty to another. THC hadn't been discovered yet when the 61 convention was passed. So it was rather, I would say, obviously stuck in the next convention. It was probably more easy for them to do that, I would imagine. But it's never been really rational, and it's created very bad conflicts of perception, because inside the UN system, it's believed that synthetic THC is covered under the 71 convention, where natural plant-based THC extracts would be naturally covered under the 1961 convention, even though they'd be the same product, right? That's not cool. And also CBD, where it can be considered not under treaty, and it is. CBD is not written in the treaty anywhere, so it's not in the treaty. But if it's a marijuana extract, it's then still covered under that 1961 catch-all of a cannabis extract. So the very pure, not plant-based CBD has an edge over the plant-based CBD. And the WHO tried to correct these things with a note on the CBD, several changes and moves to correct all the THC and isomer stuff and put it all in the same treaty. And the UN rejected all that stuff. And it's surprising, because it really didn't change control levels. And all it did was put the plant material on par with its synthetic, non-plant-based copies. And then the one other thing that was more significant that they didn't accept was to take some preparations of cannabis that were harder to abuse, like, let's say, the cannabis cough medicine, like the codeine cough medicine kind of drugs. And those were to be put in Schedule 3. So it would have been 1/3, allowing a broad range of options to the country that wanted to put cannabis over the counter without a prescription even. That would be that Schedule 3. Or the 1 is, like I said, like anything else, a prescription medicine. It really doesn't call for a specific schedule because of just being in the treaty. It's everything's in the treaty, and all the schedules apply to all the drugs in the treaty. So I think that it's one of these things where it's spun around in a lot of different ways, but clearly the intent of this is to open up medicinal access to cannabis, normalize cannabis as a medicine, recognize it has medical value, and remove it from that restricted category, like I said, where it was right in between methamphetamine, crystal methamphetamine, and heroin. That's not where it belongs on the shelf, and everybody knows it by now. So anyway, you wanted to hear about history. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about history. So I actually got into this when I got out of the service. I was in retraining in tech school, in Virginia Tech.
How long?
I got out. I went in 1981, and I got out in 86. So I was in during peacetime, as they say. It was the Cold War, but they call it peacetime.
I went in 79, and I tore the cartilage in my knee and got out after about 9 months. So being a disabled veteran, they paid my way through college, including going to school in China.
There you go. Benefits the benefits can be very, very useful for your life. So, but I actually went into school. I was in engineering school at Virginia Tech, and while I was in engineering school, as a hobby, I was involved in marijuana activism. I got involved in local NORML chapter at the university. And even though my education kind of fizzled out, I really wasn't able to handle the ambitious sort of schedule and everything without the kind of medication that I needed. Cannabis wasn't available to me at Virginia Tech, and I really suffered pretty hard and tried. I really tried, and I had good grades, but I just couldn't hack it. But I kept up with cannabis activism. It was something that kept my brain busy and gave me something to do in my retirement. And it actually led me to a lot of different places, a lot of different things. I presented at the United Nations in 1998, brought in the Marijuana Policy Project, and we did a side event at the World Drug Summit in New York. And I presented on myself and my story, and it was very kind of, it was a turning point for me. It was one of those moments where I realized, as a veteran, I really shouldn't even be sitting here having to say what I'm about to say. And what I told them was that my own country didn't respect my medical needs. That when I was over in the Netherlands, I'd been traveling in Holland, and when I was over there, doctor could just write me a prescription for cannabis. I can get it through normal channels. There was nothing really outrageous about it. It was perfectly legal. And coming back to the United States, and when I made that presentation at the UN, it really hit me that that was a bad situation. It was an untenable situation where this country that I really loved, the Netherlands, but didn't owe me anything, was respecting my medical needs better than my own country that did actually owe me something for my military service, arguably. That was a turning point for me. So a year before that, I actually met in 1997 with Jack Hare and Dennis Perone and Chris Conrad. And it was kind of a special meeting that I pulled together on the margins of the World Hemp Expo Extravaganza. I don't know if you remember that. It was at Bill Condi's place.
Oregon. I was there.
You're there. And I pulled them together. I actually went on a pilgrimage all the way from Virginia, all the way out there, to your neck of the woods, really just to talk to these guys, because I knew they would be in one place at one time. And I expected from this meeting, honestly, for them to tell me all these great things that I could get connected with, because I had already met them years before in the Netherlands when I was working over there with green prisoners and the Drugs Peace House. When I learned what got me started on all this, was there. And I'd kind of come back around, and I was looking at the treaties, and I was looking at the U.S. Constitution, where it said that treaties were the supreme law of the land in the U.S. And all this got me really started and activated, but I was sure that they had a bunch of people working on this already. And when I asked them, that was what they would say. They didn't. Actually, they looked at me and they said, that sounds like a good idea, Mike, go for it. You do that. And, that was basically my mandate with these guys, some of my heroes, really, our heroes from the cannabis movement, telling me to go for it. It was kind of my mandate and it took 10 full years really to get in the door. It took 10 years, in 98 to 2008, to get our badges and to really get our foothold, understand how the system worked, really, be navigating the system. And then the next level where we start working.
What you're talking about is working with the World Health Organization and the United Nations. That's pretty ambitious. It's not, 5 years to get your feet on the ground sounds like you did pretty well.
Yeah, we actually, we didn't start on the WHO until that seed resolution. That's when it came across our table. So we started working at the WHO level, and we didn't actually go to Geneva, at least I didn't, until 2015. And I at this point now, I've been over to Geneva like 5 different times, to hearings and to participate. We brought in a significant amount of pressure on the World Health Organization to do a good job, but we also really were team players and just tried to bring them the information as we saw it, give them the input, give them the evidence, give them the experiences from our people out in the field, in the industry, patients, advocates, doctors, scientists, and we had faith that if they had a good panel, and we did feel like they had a good panel once they got rid of Bertha Madras, she would have biased the entire panel, but they got rid of her. And then we felt like the panel was fair, and they are really good scientists. It's called the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, the ECDD, within the World Health Organization. And we worked with them for years. And we had faith that they would be able to digest this information and come out with something useful. And we felt like, and we still feel like, our faith was well rewarded. Their outcome is good.
The science has always been on our side, and so I knew eventually we had to win because the science has always been on our side for marijuana legalization. It was on our side when I first started to read it as a teenager back in the 1970s. And it's always been in our favor. You're able to, with the scientists will listen. If they don't have an emotional attachment, eventually the facts break through.
And I think it's important to understand sort of the ramifications of this inside the United States. The DEA has been mandated by the Attorney General to carry the day-to-day responsibilities of scheduling under what's called the treaty, what I'm calling the treaty clause of our Controlled Substances Act. Now, I'm calling it because the movement has largely ignored this section of code in the Controlled Substances Act since it was passed. We've been fighting in the scheduling of cannabis, fighting over whether cannabis has accepted medical value in the United States and everything. Well, guess what? That section of code in the CSA is superseded by the next section of code, which is what I'm calling the treaty clause. So it's amazing. We've been fighting for like 50 years on a piece of code that's actually superseded by something that could just overrule us if we ever did win in our previous battle. And up till now, the Attorney General's guidance has been it has to be in Schedule 1 or 2 in the United States under our schedules to comply with the treaty. And that's clearly not going to be the case anymore. That is based, on either being like heroin or like cocaine. You can make an argument that cocaine, but not heroin. So in other words, Schedule 1 is out. Schedule 1 is no longer supported by treaty. Schedule 2 is undoubtedly going to be where the DEA is going to argue we need to move. But why would Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 be available to us before?
THC itself is Schedule 4, right?
THC is Schedule 3. And that's in the Marinol pill. And that's what I'm thinking is going to wind up being the end of the negotiations here. Clearly, the treaty supports more of a change than just to Schedule 2 if that was already available to us before. And not being on par with a drug that contains the co-active ingredient, THC, which is Schedule 3, it's mind-boggling that we're actually still arguing about this. But the treaty change should support a change to 3, at least. It's arguable that it wouldn't go much further, like I said, a negotiation. Obviously, if the DEA is as adamant as I expect them to be that we need to stay in Schedule 2, it might wind up being that we wind up negotiating the Schedule 3. But I would hope that an incoming Biden administration would see this as an opening to reschedule to 3, 4, or 5, make this a little bit better, access. Open up the medical cannabis side, take some of the heat off the whole conversation. If we still have a locked Congress, if those Senate seats, which are still up in the air as of this taping, go to the Democrats, then we might wind up moving with the MORE Act, which would change the whole landscape. It would deschedule cannabis in the United States. The treaty be damned. but if that's not the case, then the executive branch change is going to be really the only game in town. And I'm hoping at least that will give like I said, the incoming administration a little bit more breathing room as to what they could do.
All right. How do you feel? It's really up in the air in terms of the MORE Act, whether it's going to come up in the next Congress. This is kind of akin to what happened in Mexico, in that one half of the bicameral legislature said, yeah, we can legalize marijuana, but the other half of the bicameral legislature, in our case, the House of Representatives, in Mexico's case, the Chamber of Deputies, said, in our case, it's the Senate, and in their case, it's the Senate passed it, and the Chamber of Deputies is not going to allow it to go through. So it's akin to that. It just kicks the can down the road.
Yeah, the MORE Act has a kind of a hole in it, from my perspective, at least a blind spot. Let me call it a blind spot with regard to that treaty clause. Again, it doesn't prevent the MORE Act from being effective or going into law. There wouldn't be any challenge against it based on this. However, if that treaty clause is left and it just doesn't apply to cannabis anymore because of the MORE Act, that's going to be a little bit cryptic. There won't be anything to explain it in the law. There's nothing in that treaty clause that actually says cannabis or says marijuana. So there won't be any explanation there for future generations to understand why that treaty clause no longer applies to marijuana. They'd have to understand the history of the legislation, and it would be a little difficult. What we're recommending, Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access recommendation, we worked out with Eric Sterling. One of the last things we did with him with Criminal Justice Policy Foundation was to come up with language, which is so simple. just a little explanatory note that the MORE Act could put in that would explain that this MORE Act would nullify the treaty clause with respect to marijuana, and it would make it clear to those in the future that were reading it, what just happened. A clarifying note is something that they've done. Evidently, they do that kind of thing in the law, and it doesn't change the text or in any way the meaning of the law. So I don't think it would be controversial.
So if our audience wants to reach you at Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, what's the best way to reach out to you, Michael?
These days, we are most active on Facebook, and you could reach out to us directly through our Facebook page, Facebook, slash, what is it now? I can't remember. VMCA USA. USA VMCA. I can't remember right off the top of my head. Anyway, Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. Yeah, on Facebook. You can tell I don't type the actual URL in very often anymore. Yeah. Everything's just right there when you click on the links. But take a look on Facebook and get a hold of us. Most of the information about the vote and everything is in the C&D monitor that we did with Kenzie Zamuli, and he's a really great independent researcher out of Barcelona who we've been working with at the UN, sort of my counterpart on these projects. And so if you look up CND monitor and then his name, Kenzie, Kenzi, that'll come right up on Google. And you can read all about the WHO recommendations, all the facts, and in which way different countries voted, background information. And then there's even more information, background in what he's called the Crimson Digest. And again, just type in Crimson Digest and Kenzie, it would pull it right up on Google. And that has the whole history of the United Nations Drug Control Program, the whole history of the World Health Organization process, these recommendations, a lot more depth. So I encourage those that want to read about that to, dig into our paperwork. And we've had some great press. The New York Times pulled up an article, basically the first article that came up was New York Times, with a reasonably good headline.
Times. I quoted you at the top of the show from a direct quote from New York Times.
There you go. We've had, I'd say, 30 or 40 different news articles from around the globe, a few TV spots, and even got picked up on a comedy, late night comedy. And I think it's gotten out there. I was afraid, a little bit afraid that this thing would pass and they go and take a microphone to someone in the cannabis movement who had no idea what was going on. I actually wasn't really braced for them actually finding us. It was just a circuitous path that the New York Times actually found us to talk to us. But I'm glad they did. And a lot of media articles like Vice and others have quoted our friends in Europe that we were working with in Vienna. And most of the articles are quoting Kenzie and I and our team. So really, really proud of that and glad glad that Russia wasn't able to dominate the spin. They're a little upset. Russia, Nigeria, those who lost the vote are Kevin Sabat. They're all a little bit upset. Yeah.
Russia has quite a history with hemp and cannabis in the past, so but not since the communist revolution, I guess. At least the 60s.
Virtually. Well, check this out. Over the last few months, as we were going through all these meetings and everything, in Russia, Nigeria, and Indonesia, and a lot of other countries, we were just yelling at the World Health Organization, yelling at everybody, anti-cannabis stuff, some of the stuff that would make Harry Anslinger blush, and every horrible talking points. The crazy thing is
caused by cannabis.
The crazy thing is that without exception, these countries over the last few months, just really in real time, have had headlines about emerging medical cannabis programs in their country. Indonesia, Philippines, Russia, all these countries have had this kind of emerging in real time as they've been at the UN yelling basically completely irrelevant stuff, because this is about medical cannabis access. This isn't about legalizing marijuana in the end. That's not even, they're fighting against the wrong thing at the wrong time, or fighting, I don't know how you put it. You know what I mean.
They're brainwashed. That's what it
exactly.
is.
So thanks again for paying attention to this stuff, and I'm glad to be able to share some good news. And we'll
Good
see
to
what it
have.
does. 186 countries got a little shove.
All right. Thank you, Michael, and congratulations. Keep up the good work. Look forward to seeing you in the real world sometime soon.
Oh, real soon. Absolutely. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much to Scott Herb Thrasher. He's put on a lot of work here. This is all his work today, and with some help from volunteers. And also, he is the director of Portland Normal, which is the organization in this state that is for consumers. And that's a voice that often gets lost, especially these days with so-called legalization in this state. I personally didn't have much of a speech plan because I spent the last 3 months of my life wasted on a swindler who was going to invest in me. But that's what we have now these days, is these sharks circling, these people who haven't been involved in cannabis at all and don't really care about the plant are now circling to try to make money. And so I just want everybody to be conscious of that and aware of it, and aware of who you support when you do buy products, and that it's people who really do care about this plant. As he said, I've been involved in Seattle. I actually moved here a year and a half ago because I fell in love with a grower down here. But I've been a cannabis activist in Washington State since 1995. And, what's happening up there is not pretty. And it's, so-called legalization. But, who thinks this is legal? Do we think this is legal? Because the feds certainly don't. The feds think you're all criminals still. And the reason that our regulations are so ugly is because of the feds. Up in Washington, it's like they treat it like plutonium or something when it's a plant that helps people. I actually had a friend contact me this morning who said that he had a friend up in Tacoma who had a 5-year-old who has a serious illness and really needs cannabis. And he's actually calling, this is in a state that's supposedly legal, and you can go to the store and buy it, and they can't find help for their 5-year-old. And that's what's sad, is that it used to be easier to help children, but with all the regulations that are getting piled on people and the way they're just getting rid of medical, the true growers aren't there anymore, and you can't find these products that actually help people. So down here, I actually had the fortune to spend some time down in Applegate Valley last few days with some just incredible growers who put a lot of time and energy into making extracts that they can give to people with cancer and children. And they told me a story about a friend whose dad they've been getting oil to for free. And the doctor said, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it. So we know that it works. And these are people that, the state and the feds would love to run out of the business so that they can put more and more regulations on this and track where every single seed and plant goes, because God forbid that it get out to people, that we share it. So it's so crucial that we keep home grows and then we keep medical gardens, because these are people who are trying to get genetics out to people, the genetics that help people, instead of just trying to get the highest THC. And they're the people that can be shut out because they don't have the money that it takes to follow these regulations. They're really expensive. Everybody wants cheap pot, but it costs a lot of money. When you've got so many regulations on you, you have to buy this expensive software, put tags on every plant, pay all these ridiculous taxes. 280E doesn't allow businesses to deduct expenses at the federal level. The feds are taking half of the profits from people. So it's really expensive to get in. So this fight is not over. While you're here, walk around to all the booths and sign up for things. It's okay to sign up for all of them. There's a lot of groups out there, but there's a lot of issues. There's going to be a lot of groups. People talk about, we all need to get together under one umbrella. And that's fine if you have some commonalities, but there's so many issues out there. I was thinking about all these. Let's see, there's smoking lounges, there's county bans, there's 280E, there's edible limits, overregulation, pesticides, patients, small growers. There's so many issues to focus on, and all the different organizations kind of have a different niche. So be part of it. Sign up for all the lists, and if there's one that really speaks to you, get active, get involved, because this fight isn't over. And we get complacent when we think it's legal, but it's not. There's still people serving life in prison for pot, and even when it is legal and it seems like it's a good thing, we can all come out here and smoke pot together. But behind the scenes with the industry, there's regulations going on that don't help. They actually hurt. All these cups that we enjoy going to, this is just one example. And actually, Oregon's doing a much better job than Washington, I'll tell you that much. But one of the regulations in Oregon is that, the people who get a recreational license can only give samples to other people with recreational license in order to try to sell it. That means that when a cup comes along next year, a recreational grower can't give a sample to the cup. That it's not legal. They'd have to actually go to the store and buy it to submit it to a cup. And I brought that up to the OLCC, and they claim that that's not what they intend to do, so maybe we'll see some changes. But it's little things like that they're just so concerned with tracking every bit because it might get leaked out, God forbid, somewhere. And they don't think about the actual effect on the industry, the people who've been in this so long and know what's best for the plant and for patients. And they're worried about it might go to another state. Well, you know what? If it's going to other states, at least they're not getting it in Mexico, right? So isn't that horrible? Hopefully we have to continue the fight to legalize it federally. That's just the number one thing right now, I think. And so, like I said, go around, sign up. Thank you so much for coming. Remember Seattle Hemp Fest.
Think about hemp, industrial hemp. See, I think that the medical marijuana movement will get a lot further if they will reach out and help explain the realities of hemp, the larger issue of hemp. Hemp, medical marijuana. Hemp helps everybody. Hemp helps the earth. Hemp is earth medicine. And I don't see enough awareness being given to hemp as hemp. We're too busy using the medical marijuana for our own enjoyment and to help heal the pain and these different things. But we're ignoring hemp. Hemp will help the planet. Practical reality, if we're going to talk about medicine, all right, we're talking about medical marijuana as medicine for the people, but hemp is medicine for the earth. And if we forget the earth, then we're only going halfway there. Anyway, that's just some attitude, all right? Hemp. Hemp. Industrial hemp. You can build your home out of it. You can make your clothes out of it. And hemp, the CBDs in hemp, all right, are they serve a larger medicinal purpose for the human body than even the THC does. And people need to kind of look at this. Because we're talking about diabetes, we're talking about epilepsy, we're talking about cancer. It's very effective against breast cancer. All right, we're talking about a real deal here, but nobody's paying any attention to it. All the attention is being put to the THC aspect, and I think it's time to recognize the entire plant. For the earth, for us.